Nowadays, the sight of combat helmets is nothing new, with most being composite in nature, that being made up of multiple layers of a mixed material, usually with ballistic protecting properties. Like the steel helmets that preceded them, various types are out there, with some offering better protection due to shape or the science behind them, while others are more popular or far-reaching due to availability or cost. Though these helmets really started to be seen on a large scale during the 1980s, there were a few examples of earlier ones that made a big splash for a number of reasons, with one of the most widespread and extensive being the M76 out of South Korea, which would eventually morph into the Iraqi series of helmets that began with the M80. So, prepare for a sort of 2-for-1 video with this one. Before we start, it's important to mention a few things, the most significant being names and designations. Due to the long, extensive, and widespread use of these helmets, official designations are a bit vague, and due to collectors doing what they do, unofficial names have become the dominant form of identifying and differing them from one another. So, throughout this video, we'll be using them. Additionally, the history behind these helmets is somewhat murky and a bit disjointed, so as with any topic with a less than complete story, we'll cover all the angles and try to put everything together as best as possible. That being said, there are really two origins to these helmets depending on the angle you look at it from. But to get the full picture, let's start at the beginning. After the end of the Second World War, many nations saw themselves modernizing or at least shuffling up a lot of weaponry, equipment, and uniforms of their armed forces. Being produced in such massive numbers, the US's M1 helmet was seen worldwide, and with an abundance left over, it wasn't long until the helmet caught on with numerous nations, be it directly or through clones. However, as the decades progressed, certain countries started looking into trying to improve upon not only the design but also material and protective capabilities of combat helmets. Though some outliers, such as Germany, had been playing around with the idea of bulletproof composite material as early as the 1950s, it really wasn't until the early 1970s that one start to begin to be seen. This is where the M76 sort of begins its life. Though Germany ultimately didn't develop and adopt a ballistic helmet until the 1990s, they did during the late 60s and early 70s experiment with a number of compositions and helmet designs. Enter the material known as Corlon, which has something of a vague and rather segmented history. Looking at this 1980s article made by and for the German company Technolog, it states that it is a reinforced fiber composite with ballistic core, and claims that, depending on design, is 110% stronger than conventional steel helmets, but still lighter and more economic. In addition, above it says that the company, in conjunction with the German Ministry of Defense, developed their first ballistic helmet in 1972, then essentially built its business out, resulting in Corlon and Technolog helmets being seen worldwide. Now that sounds all pretty straightforward except for one thing. Corlon, or at least the name Corlon, has been around since the mid-1940s, according to a US trademark for it, being registered and owned by a Pennsylvania-based company, Armstrong, which originally made and sold corks but slowly moved into flooring manufacture and sales. In the trademark, it states that Corlon is a hard-surfaced floor covering having a synthetic resinous binder. And since then, advertisements for Corlon-based products, be they floors, walls, and whatever else, have made their way into various publications. So whether these two Corlons are directly related or not is hard to say, but regardless, a form of it was being advertised to companies to be used in the creation of early composite helmets, and it seems that it may have made its way to South Korea, where it would eventually be used in the creation of the M76. The story, according to Dr. Han Pil-soon, then an engineer at the Agency for Defense Development, went as follows. In 1971, they received news about Israel succeeding in developing a composite helmet, which had met the same standards as then common existing ones. Quick to try and do the same, he and a team made up of government officials and research institute members got to work. After months of testing impact capabilities using a pointed weight on various compositions simply described as being made of layers of nylon cloth and liquid synthetic resin, a successful test was finally achieved. Quick to create a mock-up helmet, it went through more tests, with it being run over with jeeps and trucks and hit with a hammer for impact and general strength demonstrations, with the last major one coming in mid-June 1971 in the backyard of the Blue House, South Korea's then presidential residence. After the helmet was hit full force with a hammer by a security guard, it said that it was either dented or simply chipped some. Either way though, it resulted in a success. He was then instructed to develop 300 of them, and not long after, 2 companies were contracted to mass produce them, eventually leading to the spread of the necessary machinery and process to others, leading to even larger scale production. The final product came in the form of a lightweight composite helmet appearing almost identical to the later model US M1 and its accompanying liner, as the M1 had been the standard of South Korean forces since the Korean War thanks to heavy US material support which went on through much of the Cold War. Today this helmet bears many names such as the Bangtan helmet, translated to bulletproof helmet, M1 nylon helmet, and perhaps most commonly the M76. though now also old bulletproof helmet as newer models have since been introduced. So let's take a look at what would be a standard example of an M76. Looking at the outside, you can see it bears a pretty similar appearance to the M1 down to the darker green paint and smaller rough texture to help cut down on sheen and reflections. The main difference is the appearance of the 15 rivets protruding around the outside. 6 rivets, 3 on each side, are used to attach the swivel bail anchor points for the chin strap, with the most common style being the Korean War era T1, though as years progressed, newer ones designed by the US, such as the updated 1975 style, were also seen. Another 6 are for circular washer-type pieces seen on the inside used to connect the Hammock X-style suspension webbing, allowing for them to simply be pulled out for cleaning or replacement. This again was based around US designs, as later model M1 liners utilized the same hardware. And finally, the last 3 were used to secure an adjustable neck strap to help prevent tilting. The suspension's liner saw adjustment points around the band as well as on 3 of the lower cross straps, with accompanying sweatbands which could be easily replaced, as they too use the same securing method as their US counterparts. But now let's talk a bit about overall quality. Naturally, due to the story as far as composition really only using general and somewhat vague words and terms such as bulletproof material, nylon, plastic, and synthetic resin, some questions have been raised as to whether or not Corlon was even used, though many sources claim as such. Either way, though, what is known as the level of protection these helmets provided resulted in a bit of controversy, much later on though. Within South Korea, the helmet would begin being issued to reserve troops, with it becoming standard issue for all forces sometime between 1974 and 76, thus the designation M76. However, it wasn't really until 2013 where concerns raised about its overall ballistic and protective capabilities. Seeing a newer helmet, the KHB-2000, begin development in the mid-1990s, with issuing starting in 2003, the M76 remained in service to many around the country, with it still even being used as of 2024 within certain units. However, in 2013, it was reported by various news agencies about how service rifles of North Korea, those being the Type 58 and 68, were able to penetrate through them. Considering when developing it, emphasis was placed on blunt force versus direct ballistic impact, the M76 wasn't really bulletproof, but compared to many other ones out there at the time of its creation, it was marginally better, but when looked at in modern terms, it has a decently low protection rating. Type 58s and 68s have a muzzle velocity of approximately 715 meters, or about 2,346 feet per second, while the helmets were resistant up to 275 meters, or about 902 feet per second, which doesn't sound very good. But when put up against the protection rating of standard steel M1s, which, when originally created, needed to withstand bullets traveling around 243 meters or 800 feet per second, they fare better and interestingly score a little higher of the 110% efficiency rating stated by the Technolog advertisement. Regardless of one's outlook on the overall quality and protection of these helmets, one thing is for certain: they were good enough for South Korea's armed forces and helped bolster their economy and defense industry by way of large-scale exporting, which in some cases led to them being copied, be it directly or with slight modifications. Specifics as far as buying and exporting of these helmets are hard to pin down though. Various South Korean companies produced them over the years, meaning exact quantities, subtle differences, dates, and so on are not really easily accessible. However, some websites and suppliers to this day still offer them for sale. Though figures can't really be stated, what can though is that since their creation they've gone all across the globe, with 2 continents seeming to be the most popular: South America and Asia, with the following countries being some which have used them: Chile, Uruguay, Venezuela, Brazil, Mexico, Nepal, Mongolia, and Iraq, which is undoubtedly the most interesting and well-known user. But to best understand how the M76 turned into the M80 and its subsequent versions, we first must look at the geopolitics of Iraq during that time, specifically during the Iran-Iraq War. Though the first move of the war was brought on by Iraq, conflict had been seemingly more and more inevitable due to a number of factors ranging from various territorial and border disputes, such as the Shatu al-Arabi waterway, an area where both the Tigris and Euphrates rivers converge, to political and ethnic rivalries exacerbated by then recent changes in government control of both nations. Iran with its recent revolution, which led to a dominant Shiite government, and Iraq with Saddam Hussein taking control of both his dominantly Sunni Ba'athist party along with the country. Additionally, with Ayatollah Khomeini leading the revolution and installing a theological-backed government now in control of a rather large military possessing a wealth of newer US and Western equipment and weaponry, concern in Iraq grew that Iran would try to push their ideology and influence in the area and use it as a means to destabilize Iraq. And so on September 22, 1980, Iraq launched a series of aerial and ground attacks against what they believed was still a politically unsolidified Iran, in the hopes of decisively crippling their air force, which in turn would give them the upper hand in capturing and holding the waterway and surrounding region. What followed was nearly 8 years of back-and-forth fighting. Now, forces on both sides saw quite an assortment of units, be they officially military, volunteer, or supported by parties and groups, and because of this, naturally quite an assortment of weaponry, gear, and uniforms were used, often being supplied by an equally interesting assortment of sources. Due to a strong European influence within the region for many of the early decades of the 20th century, relations with a few remained somewhat. Add in foreign concerns of certain ideologies or powers being bolstered or spreading throughout the region, and you have yourself a number of foreign backers on both sides supplying a wide range of vehicles, weapons, and materiel, helmets being among these. One of the largest suppliers of helmets was the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which, after the end of World War II, saw a vested interest in many areas of the world to try and gain support against the West. This in turn also saw donations and the selling of military materiel. Because of these two factors, both Iraq and Iran fielded a number of foreign steel helmets from both NATO and the Warsaw Pact, with Iraq prevalently fielding a variety of SSH-style helmets, one notable one being Poland's WZ-50. The Soviet Union had been an ally of Iraq since the late 1950s, going so far as to sign an agreement in 1967 saying they would export oil to them in return for supplies and arms. On top of that, in 1972, both countries signed a 15-year-long Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, which, though vaguely stated they would assist each other politically, economically, scientifically, and militarily. But with the Iranian Revolution and the ousting of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the pro-Western Shah, Iran saw an opportunity to align themselves with other countries that would be anti-Western and more significantly anti-US, i.e. the USSR. And so on the eve of the war, the Soviet Union had been supporting both sides through various means. However, once fighting started, it, in a way, found itself in the middle, and so they essentially made a point to not get involved by cutting back on supplying both, though Eastern Bloc Materiel did continue to make its way to Iraq to some extent. Because of this, the supply of helmets for Iraq had dropped, and so it had to look elsewhere for new ones. Though Iraq had started the war and was seen as an aggressor for much of it, many Western powers continued to supply and support them, with France being one of the most significant. But they didn't look that direction for a new helmet, but rather east, to South Korea and its M76. Making its way to the country around 1980, the M76 would eventually gain the unofficial designation of M80, due to it, well, being first seen worn then. But why not just keep calling it the M76? Well, mainly because once Iraq got its hands on the design, it wasn't long until slight differences and eventually variants started to be seen. The most noticeable differences were in their colors, as during the war many shades of green were observed. However, as the 1980s moved forward, more tan and sandy colors began to appear too. It isn't all that uncommon to come across examples bearing multiple layers, such as this one which sees 3 sandy colors, not to mention a 4th black on the inside. However, it wasn't only hand-done cosmetic alterations that were seen, as often very subtle changes to actual components were observed too. Things like overall size and thickness of the helmet, rivets of various diameters being less spherical and flatter, the swivel bail anchor points for the chin straps seeing slight differences in their metals, colors of the sweatband, and of course manufacturers' stamps and markings. Which actually brings us to the various companies that produce them. Through the life of these helmets, and to a slightly lesser extent the succeeding versions, manufacturers of all kinds were encountered and usually fell within 2 categories. Ones based in Eastern Asia, South Korea and China being the main 2, and ones from the Middle East, specifically areas around Iraq, such as Jordan. Not always seen due to things like removal or just prolonged wear, many left marks inside the helmets in the form of stickers, stamps, or embossings. Though a few are straightforward, others are a bit more vague and discussed, with the most widely seen being a triangle with a stylized version of the 5th letter of the Arabic alphabet, Jim. Seen with a few variations, this Jim mark would essentially become a sort of property marker associated with numerous pieces of Iraqi military uniforms and gear. With all these sources being seen, naturally the question of the composite material has been raised, as some say the Chinese and Middle Eastern produced M80s had different, or at least altered compositions, making them less protective and actually used Corlon as opposed to South Korea, which as mentioned earlier may have used other more effective material. Again, it's a bit murky when it comes to the actual composite material of most of these helmets. Now, we're not going to get into every single nuanced element, as there are quite a few, and finding examples to showcase the differences would be borderline impossible, but that certainly hasn't stopped some, and if you want to take a look at a few fantastic breakdowns and guides, be sure to check out the websites for Iraqi Militaria and Middle East Militaria, which showcase numerous variants they've come across while also breaking them down by style and rarity. Back to their use though. During the war they were seen all over and used by many units, with some even making their way into the hands of Iranian troops. But due to the length of the war, economic impact it had, variety of manufacturers over numerous years, the influx of troops, not to mention their continued use through the 1990s resulting in extensive use and reuse, and you have yourself a helmet with a single specific name but a dizzying level of subtle differences. To best summarize the M80 though, it can be said that it was a mix of imports of a single helmet which, when looked at in a certain way, resulted in them becoming a
copy of a copy of a copy.
Meaning that you'll run into M80s that are virtually identical to South Korean M76s such as this one, and others that are a little or a lot less so. But looking forward, come the end of the war, Iraq was hurting financially, which would eventually lead to the start of another conflict, the Gulf War, but also the creation of a second version, the M90. But before getting to that, we'd like to thank the guys over at Gear Rack. Being big military historians, they helped make this video possible, selling everything from US and European military surplus to one-off rare items such as many of the Iraqi helmets seen in this video. So if you're looking for military surplus, be it uniforms, field gear, or anything else in between, you can check them out at gearrack.com, and while there, be sure to use promo code UNIFORMHISTORY10 for a 10% discount on your first order. Thanks again guys, and on to the M90. With United Nations Resolution 598 coming into effect on August 8, 1998, the war between Iran and Iraq officially came to an end, seeing both sides effectively reverting their borders back to pre-war statuses as outlined by the 1975 Algiers Agreement. It is worth bringing up that throughout the war, Iraq was not shy in its use of chemical weapons, sometimes used against Iranian troops but more frequently on Kurdish populations, with the most infamous being the Halabja massacre coming only months before the end of hostilities. This in turn caused foreign backers and other countries alike to become somewhat weary of Saddam and his administration, leading to attempts to impose sanctions. However, those didn't come until after the events in 1990, which we'll get to promptly. With neither side of the war having much to show for it, many say there was no clear winner. One thing was for certain though, it did result in Iraq expanding its military power substantially, both from a numerical and technological standpoint. However, at the same time, it drastically crippled the country's economy as both nations accrued hundreds of billions in losses, with Iraq alone seeing nearly $130 billion in foreign debts, much of which were held by its neighbors Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And so it wasn't long until conflict would begin again. Due to a mix of disagreements over debts incurred during the war, long-running territorial disputes, issues surrounding oil production and the claim Kuwait was slant drilling, as well as growing paranoia on Saddam Hussein's part that Kuwait and other nearby countries were conspiring against them, Iraq launched an invasion of its southern neighbor on August 2, 1990, effectively beginning the Gulf War, which would see international sanctions imposed on it, straining its already weakened economy even further. It was around this time the M90 helmet made its way out into the world. Of all the Iraqi-produced helmets, this one seems to have the most variables when it comes to identifying and chronicling them, as even the name is a bit misleading, as they first started being seen around 1988 to 1989, but gained its collector designation due to them first being seen on a large scale in 1990. Generally though, when talking about them, they fall into one of two categories. One's made before the invasion of Kuwait, and one's made after. We're not going to get too much into the nuanced differences with these, but we'll touch on it some. Though there are varying shades of color, these were seen in two primary ones, green and a sandy tan. Let's start with the latter, as it's the more commonly seen variant. Looking at one, many immediately get a feeling of it being much cheaper, as models often featured little to no texture on the outside, giving it a much smoother appearance, which has drawn comparisons to a costume piece or even a toy. To add to this was the biggest and most noticeable difference, a protective rubber band added around the rim. Being somewhat easy to remove, these did help with keeping covers and accessories, be they cloth, netting, burlap, or anything else, in place, but their reason was actually much more significant, as it was added to help mitigate cracking, chipping, and splintering around their rim, as the composition of the helmet seemingly changed for the worse, in that they were now slightly heavier as well as being much more brittle, with mentions of plastic and fiberglass being core components. The reason for this drastic change in quality likely boiled down to internationally imposed sanctions and the subsequent cost-cutting measures employed to meet demand. When looking at the rivets along the outside, they seem to be slightly less intrusive in that they're much flatter yet wider in diameter and decrease the overall count from 15 to 11. Though this seems like it may have been a decision to try and streamline or update the design, many indications point to the opposite, as it appears elements were again lifted from a US M1 liner, but instead of newer ones that South Korea based theirs on, they were modeled off older, obsolete ones worn from World War II through the late 1960s. This becomes more evident when looking at the inside, as the hardware and general layout of components are strikingly similar. The chin strap, now thinner in width, was a single strap sewn at one end and fed through the other, being adjusted and connected by way of a slide and latch component. Instead of swivel bales as seen with the original, there were now flat A-shaped pieces of hardware. The suspension webbing went from the more resilient, easily removable and adjustable X-hammock style to a 3-strap O-style one that was connected and adjusted with a smaller tie, seeing it secured to the helmet using triangular A-shaped washers, both of these being elements lifted from the older M1 liner. This made the management and servicing of the helmet a bit harder, and with the added metal components often being prone to rusting, it frequently caused staining and damage to the cloth pieces. Seemingly the only beneficial, or at least non-intrusive change to the suspension was that it now matched the shell color, as often tan ones were seen with tan and green with green, though there were instances of mixing and matching. As for the sweatbands, they remained similar in design, however were now often made of a black vinyl type material rather than leather. Finally, the adjustable 3-pointed neck strap was now thicker but directly connected and seemingly only one size. Going back to the whole pre- and post-Gulf War classification, that applies to the sand-colored ones and are usually based on things like gym markings along with subtle differences in the webbing shade and quality. However, there is a bit of discourse related to the helmet's color too. Technically, the first M90s were made at the end of the 1980s. They were green, with many being susceptible to the same damage around the rim, which led to the eventual adding of the protector band when the decision was made to switch the production color from green to tan. However, some green examples, such as this one, exist, which weigh a little more and have a slightly improved level of quality overall, leading to a somewhat safe assumption the composite material is a little better. Now, some green M90s of this caliber have been encountered with gym markings inside, leading some to infer they were made after the invasion of Kuwait and as such have been sometimes referred to as M92s. So to best describe the potential order of M90 production, there are a few possibilities. These better green ones were made first before quality dropped, leading to more brittle ones, which then had their production color switched to tan, as well as the introduction of the protective band. Alternatively, the brittle green ones were the first ones produced in mass, then changed to tan with the band, and after the war some improvements were made, leading to the more durable green ones. Lastly, it could be a mix of both possibilities. Take various helmet manufacturers and throw in even more economic and wartime constraints, and you have yourself a range of quality during the years the M90 was prevalent. It's hard to say with 100% certainty what the case actually is, but to sum it up, if they have 11 large rivets, it's considered an M90, and if its original color is green, it's a rarer variant. And speaking of variants, these two saw a variety of subtle differences which usually came down to the same things as seen with the M80s, with the more commonly seen variations being the use of a wide range of sweatbands of both synthetic and leather build, as well as the older X-hammock style suspension being added in. Again, you can check out Iraqi and Middle East Militaria's websites to see all these in great detail. Anyway, though, the M90s and the various M80s already in service saw action in a big way come 1990 and the Gulf War, during which untold numbers of them would be found scattered across battlefields and transportation routes, making them easy and interesting bringbacks for coalition forces, resulting in a massive influx of them on the surplus market. After being expelled out of Kuwait and pushed back into Iraq, leading to a ceasefire being called on February 28, 1991, Saddam and his government would remain in power, continuing to use these two helmets, though once the turn of the millennia approached, one final version of these helmets, the M80 would come about. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Iraq had to deal with constant monitoring by the United Nations and even sporadic engagements by foreign countries such as the US and UK. These often came in the form of no-fly zones as well as occasional airstrikes, but most famously and significantly were the investigations and planned removal of any potential weapons of mass destruction. Knowing of biological weapon use during the 1980s, UN weapons inspectors were constantly tasked with investigations throughout the country, which were often met with resistance.
You got weapons?
No.
Okay.
With sanctions still in place, the US took things a step further by adopting a policy in 1998 essentially supporting the idea of a regime change, which came in the form of financial support of opposition groups and parties. However, after the events of September 11, 2001 and the start of the War on Terror, the Bush administration, which had been pushing for an invasion of Iraq, now had a reason to actually do so, as they claimed Saddam's regime was a threat to the region and had ties to international terrorist groups. Though there is quite a bit more to it than that, suffice to say the United States managed to get a small coalition together and, without UN approval, formally invaded on March 20, 2003. When May 1st rolled around, US President George W. Bush would announce mission accomplished, due primarily to the defeat and collapse of the Iraqi armed forces. Though conventional warfare had more or less come to an end, fighting would continue as the invasion would turn into a protracted period seeing occupation, insurgency, a civil war, and rebuilding process which would last until December 2011, when a majority of US and remaining coalition forces would withdraw. That brings us to the third and final version of the M80 family of helmets, the M80 named that because of its similarities with the original M80 as well as the year it was first encountered, 2003. The supposed story goes that these helmets were initially designed or began production sometime around 2000, and were in the process of finding their way to Iraqi troops, but only really made it to a handful of them, most notably certain units of the Republican Guard, in time to be worn during the defense of the country against the US-led invasion. Rather, the bulk of them would make their way to troops in the months and years following the collapse of the Ba'athist Party and subsequent period, which saw rebuilding of the government under the Coalition Provisional Authority, Iraqi Transitional Government, and finally the permanent one, which came in the form of the al-Maliki administration, led by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who took office on May 20, 2006. On top of that, quite a few of them, as well as the other versions, would, again, wind up in the hands of coalition troops as keepsakes, once more making their way into the surplus and collector's markets. Looking at a helmet itself, though, it appears very similar to M80s, but if scrutinized just a bit more, the two easiest ways to tell are the rivets and weight of the helmet overall. Taking elements from both previous versions, the flat appearance was carried over from the M90, while the total number, 15, and placement orientation was lifted from the M80, that again being 6 for the chin strap swivel bail anchors, 3 for the neck strap, and 7 for the suspension webbing. Regarding the weight, they are the heaviest in the series, as overall the composite layers making up its shape are a bit thicker. As far as the actual composition goes, it seemed to have improved some, though still left much to be desired. On one hand, the finish was again textured and often came in matted light tan or green, but on the other hand, like the M90, could still easily be damaged and looked to have incorporated fiberglass. Assuming the helmet still has all of its original components though, the inside has the most evident telltale signs, as there was some old and some new. The swivel bail anchor points for the chin strap return, as did the two-piece chin strap itself. However, like the M90, they were sewn rather than clipped on, but now featured a much more rudimentary cloth, as well as a straightforward flat hook connector and adjuster buckle. The easy-to-remove suspension returned, but like the chin strap, the Hammock X design was made in a light green rough-woven cloth with the same style sweatband, often seen in a variety of colors, being able to easily be attached and replaced as needed. Finally, the adjustable free-floating neck strap was also reintroduced. Now, to add to all this, they were usually issued with a specially made 2-layered camouflage cover featuring a nylon-type scrim beneath a wider netting. Using an elastic band around the bottom, these could quickly and easily be put over these helmets. Again, like the two that preceded it, there is some variety to these, though not as widespread. Usually seeing varying shades of tan or light green, differences with angles of the shell's shape, size and thickness of the shell and/or its brim, and occasionally differences in the accompanying camouflage cover's colors. Though initially used by many after the invasion, it wasn't long until more modern and protective helmets would begin to find their way into the country. But the M80 would continue to be worn by certain units such as the Iraqi National Guard. Though it's hard to give a definitive date, more or less by the end of major operations against the Islamic State in Iraq at the end of 2017, many M80 and really any M80s or M90s that may have remained in use had more or less been phased out. So to properly wrap up this video, let's do a quick comparison between these and throw out the easiest ways to identify and differ the types. Original M76s, specifically ones used by South Korea, will usually be in much better condition overall with a nice textured finish, seeing high quality chin straps and suspension systems, while also being the lightest. With M80s, they are a bit of a mixed bag. Some will appear closer in looks to M76s, but oftentimes will feature obvious indicators they were used by Iraq. Though there are probably a few pristine examples of them out there, by and large they will usually feature various paint colors along with quite a bit of wear and tear. But be sure to check inside for any markings, be they manufacturer, government, or just ones added by former owners. The M90s, though a tad confusing when it comes to color and production order, have pretty easy identifiers. The most obvious being the protective band around the rim, as seen on many of the sand-colored ones. If there isn't one present though, simply look for the 11 larger rivets. And finally, with the M80 if it doesn't have the accompanying camouflage cover, look for the same rivet orientation as the M76 and M80s, but flat, along with the coarser light green cloth chin strap, suspension, and neckband. Oh, and overall heavier weight. As stated earlier, there are quite a few other countries that have fielded the M76, and as a result, some other local variants are out there, but even with that, they don't come close to the daunting variety of Iraqi-produced and used ones, which in a way gained a life of their own, often showcasing their stories right on the shell. Though South Korean examples can still be acquired by way of newly produced or surplus ones, with the occasional exported or variant used by other countries popping up, many consider Iraqi pieces to be the most sought after. Luckily though, quite a number of examples are still available through websites like Iraqi Militaria. But with that, we've more or less reached the end of this rather extensive look at the M76 and subsequent Iraqi versions and offshoots. Once again, a special thanks to Gear Rack for helping out with this video. You can check them out at gearrack.com. Link to their site, along with all the others mentioned throughout this video, can be found in the description below. Anyway though, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing if you haven't yet done so. If not, all good. Just be sure to check back real soon for more of the history of right here on Uniform History.